Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today entitled IEP Part 2. You should be able to see my screen at this time, and I'll try and move this little icon over here so it's out of our way. Okay, just so that you understand, this is a continuation of a workshop that we presented on Tuesday as IEP Part 1. In IEP Part 1, we addressed who is on the IEP team, the evaluation process, the present level of academic and functional performance, and our goals. Today, we will turn our attention to special education services for children with disabilities through our discussion of the program summary. The program summary includes such things as supplemental aids and services, special education, especially designed curriculum and instruction, related services, and program modifications for school personnel. Further, we will address assessments, transition, procedural safeguards, and student participation in regular educational environment. On our next slide, we're going to talk specifically about the definition of special education. And as you can see, special education is specially designed instruction needed to meet the unique needs of your child. Every IEP must include special education. Special education may include such things as listed on your slides: speech therapy, specially designed physical education services, assistive technology, training as it relates to transition and mobility, travel and mobility, vocational education, and instruction in various subject areas. Just to give you a few examples in the area of speech therapy, when we're talking about specially designed services, we would talk about such things as one-to-one individual instruction for time practicing word pronunciation with a therapist, for example. When we're talking about specially designed physical education, there may be assistance with physical activities such as gross motor skills. When we begin to discuss such things as assistive technology, we might be discussing assisting a child with work on a computer using a voice recognition device. When we're talking about such things as travel training, we might be discussing things as providing support for students with cognitive disabilities to recognize signs to guide them through or around the school building. When we talk about things like vocational education, we might be discussing things that would involve around instruction or training about employment options. And when we're talking about academic instruction, we might be talking specifically about teaching about a subject area such as math or science. Moving on to our next slide, we will begin our discussion of related services. Related services are those services that are required to assist a child to benefit from special education. And as you can see on the slide, there's a multitude of areas of related services, such as occupational or physical therapy, counseling, for example, some types of psychological services, parent training, or as we talked about before, maybe orientation and mobility training. Also, we'll be discussing supplementary aids and services. In other words, what will help your student be educated with their non-disabled peers in, for example, a regular education classroom, other education-related settings, or maybe even in the non-academic settings, such as the extracurricular areas. Some examples of the supplementary aids and services may include some of the things that are on your slide. For example, taking tests orally or having the teacher provide to the student some of the class outlines. Also, possibly a student may need a note taker, and so we would maybe, even if a note taker is not available, have someone provide the notes to the child directly. If a child has some visual impairment, maybe large print would be something that we would need to use. If there are behavioral issues, maybe a behavior modification chart might be something that would be necessary. If a child has trouble taking tests, maybe extended time would be necessary if processing becomes an issue for the child. And if we're going to talk about such things as program modifications and support, there are going to be a list that is right below here that we can take a look at right now. In other words, what will help the educators be able to modify curriculum and provide supports so that the child will learn better in the classroom? In other words, what does the IEP need to contain to assist the teacher to provide the child with what he or she needs? For example, for a child with autism, the IEP can list training and in-service instruction for that teacher so that that teacher can attend, so that they can be better prepared and provide updated information for supporting the child in working toward that child's goals. Other examples of program modifications and supports are listed on the slide. For example, training and in-service, maybe in the use of special equipment. Also, maybe some extra staff time so that they can develop a better understanding of the child's disability area. Even at some point in time, maybe a classroom aide might be necessary to support the student in the classroom. So we're also going to begin a discussion of what we call the amount of services. In other words, what is the projected beginning and the ending date of the IEP? So we're continuing actually the process, and we're going to explain that the IEP team needs to decide what amount of services a child will receive. In their discussion, the IEP team must decide the supports a child will need. On the IEP form, the team should specify how much and how often a service will be provided to support a child with a disability in school or school-related activities. It will also list where those services will take place and for how long. The IEP should have this information for all types, for example, special education, related services, supplementary aids and services, and program modifications and supports for school personnel. And looking at your slide, again, as a reminder, amount of services must be included as projected beginning and ending dates for the IEP, and for each service that is discussed, the frequency, the location, and the duration of each service must be discussed. The frequency, in other words, how much and how often, the location, where that service will take place, would it be in the classroom or some other place in the school, and for duration, in other words, how long that service will last. Moving on to the extent the child will not participate with their non-disabled peers, the question is asked, how often is your child removed from the general education setting with peers in order to receive the support identified in the IEP? Parents should always ask themselves 3 questions when considering this step. Number 1, is my child able to participate in the activity that the rest of the class is doing? Number 2, can my child benefit from participating with general educational peers, or will they need another setting to access the information being presented? And the third question that parents should keep in mind is, what kinds of supports help my child learn, and are they available in the general education setting? When we're discussing things like state and district-wise assessment, all districts are required to assess student achievement. One way this happens is when students take the state and district-wide assessment tests, usually in the 3rd through the 10th grades. This requirement extends to children with disabilities as well. The IEP should indicate what accommodations, if necessary, are needed to assist the student to take their tests. So does the particular student need a secure place to take their tests, an extra quiet place to take their test? For example, what specific other accommodations might be necessary? The IEP should indicate what accommodations, if any, are needed to assist that child in their ability to take the test. They will decide if a child will take any alternate assessments, and there is a new or many new statements as it relates to alternate assessment, but we're not going to be discussing that at this time. But to pause for a minute, I'd like to remind everybody who is on the call that our IEP Part 2 is a bit outdated at this time, and Wisconsin Facets is in the process of updating this IEP Part 2, actually IEP Part 1 and Part 2, to include all the new information and incentive that the Department of Public Instruction is providing in the area of college and career-ready IEPs. That new IEP presentation in the form of a webinar should be available in approximately 2 months. And when it does become available, we will let people know so that we can provide a date if you're interested in participating. To finish off the discussion of state and district-wide testing, one of the things that is also included is that all of the district-wide and state assessments must be aligned and must be set up so that if there is a specific reason why a student needs accommodations, those accommodations will be provided for that student. So now we're going to go into a discussion of what we call transition. We're fortunate in the state of Wisconsin because in the state of federally, the transition process is mandated to begin at age 16. But in our state, in the state of Wisconsin, the transition process is to begin at age 14. And at age 14, the IEP must contain what we call measurable post-secondary goals in the 4 areas that are listed below: in training, in education, in employment, in independent living skills where they may be appropriate. Also, at this stage, the student should be invited to the IEP meeting. Students may attend IEP meetings at any time, but especially starting at age 14, it is necessary to invite the student to the IEP meeting. The IEP, hello? The IEP in the transition process we'll be discussing more information on the IEP area, and that information will be presented in the month of March as we are providing all of our Wednesdays in the month of March for the transition period and a discussion of transition. So let's talk a little bit more of the transition services. Transition services are what we consider to be called a coordinated set of activities. The coordinated set of activities must be developed as a result of the transition training process. In doing so, they must reflect the student's needs and strengths, interests and preferences, and lead to what we call post-secondary goals, goals that take place after they leave the high school setting. And they need to specify the support needed by the student to be able to achieve those goals. A coordinated set of activities would include such things as instruction, employment objectives, related services, community experiences, post-school living objectives, and, if appropriate, daily living skills. They should also reflect the student's needs, strengths, interests, and preferences. And as we said before, they would lead to the post-secondary goals that the student desires in adult life. Also starting at age 14, and as we discussed in the slide previously, if there are certain agencies that will be providing services to the child, some of those agencies should be invited to the IEP meeting, and a coordinated set of activities, including the new agencies, should also be included. Now, also as part of the transition process, the statement that is being placed on your screen right now lets you know that 1 year before the student reaches the age of majority, a statement that the student has been informed of their rights and when they become 18 years of age should be listed. In other words, the transition of rights to the student takes place at the age of 18. This is an area where parents need to be pretty vigilant so that they can take a look and make sure that things are going the way they need to, and should discuss with their student, if the student is able to do so, how they will be continued to be involved in their child's education. Also, when exiting school, the student will receive what we discuss as a summary of performance. The summary of performance is not part of the IEP. It is a document that is provided to the student upon graduation. This document can provide post-secondary schools with valuable information about where the student is functioning and what services were provided to the student to support student achievement toward their goals. And we at Wisconsin Facets will be having a webinar on the summary of performance that will also be coming up in the not too distant future. Before the IEP team can develop goals and objectives or benchmarks and identify services, the IEP team must also discuss whether certain factors will affect the child's ability to be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum. So listed on your screen are several of those special factors that must be taken into consideration. The behavior, for example, if it's a behavior issue, what positive behavioral interventions and supports and possibly other strategies would be needed to address the behavioral needs of the child. If this child is a limited English proficiency speaker, what kinds of language needs does that child need as it relates to their IEP? In communication issues, as far as language is concerned, and special communication, what skills and strategies might be necessary? When we're talking about assistive technology, might there be some devices or services that the child needs to achieve their IEP goals? And also, if this is a child who has vision issues, what maybe they might have some Braille needs, maybe instruction in Braille and the use of Braille might be necessary. In our next slide, we talk about the notice of the IEP meeting. A notice must also be given so that parents know that they have been invited to the meeting. The notice must include the purpose, the time, the location of that meeting, and who will be attending that meeting. Parents must receive that notice inviting them of the meeting. This notice should be sent early enough for parents to make arrangements. Usually 10 days notice is considered sufficient time. The meeting must be held at a mutually agreed upon time and place. If the date and or time is difficult for the parent, you can call the person listed on the notice, explain that it's not a good time for you, and ask if they can give you possibly 3 alternate dates that might be good for you, or you can share those dates with them. The district should try to accommodate your schedule. The notice again must include the purpose, the time, and the location of the meeting, and a list of those people who will be attending their meeting and the goals. So here on our next slide, we discuss the IEP meeting options. Federal and state laws provide options for parents and schools to accommodate the challenges that we face in getting together for meetings. So for example, on our slide, parents and schools may agree to hold an IEP using alternate means, and like for example, video chat or a conference call might be a possibility. And parents and schools may agree to change the IEP without a specific face-to-face meeting. If you are going to change the IEP, there are some points that we'd like to review at this time. A decision must be individualized and not a usual practice. Schools can send the notice after school and parents can agree. No parent signature would be required. Parents always receive a copy of the revised IEP. The IEP team and the staff must be informed of the changes. Change of placement requires an IEP meeting. This cannot be done without an IEP meeting, and the IEP team must meet at least one time a year. Parents are an integral part of the IEP, and they should be considered to be a very important team member. Parents have a right to review all educational records of their child. They have the right to participate in every meeting about their child as it relates to the IEP and be a member of that IEP team. And parents are members of any group that makes decisions on placements of their child. On our next slide, we're going to talk about what we call written prior notice. A school cannot make changes to the identification, evaluation, educational placement, or free appropriate public education of a child without sending a written notice before that change happens. If a parent requests that the school make a change in one or more of the areas and the school refuses, it must send the parent a written notice explaining why. So on your slide there, the school must tell parents in advance what is going to happen or refuses what they're going to do, the reason why. They must also inform parents where they can get an additional copy of procedural safeguards if one has not been sent or they don't have an up-to-date and recent copy. They need to be able to contact parents so that they understand what their rights are. The parent has the right to review all records used in the district in reaching the decisions about their child and anything else that was considered. And again, the written prior notice must be in writing. Reaching agreement is an important part of the IEP and the work of an IEP team. Hopefully, the IEP team can reach consensus. IEP teams try to reach agreement on goals and services that will help the child participate and progress toward their goals. Reaching consensus means that the IEP team talks about everyone's opinion and then decides on the solutions that everyone is willing to try. Sometimes there's disagreement and an IEP team needs help in coming to agreement. The Wisconsin Special Education Mediation System offers free help to IEP teams that need to resolve conflicts. And there's lots of information on the Wisconsin state mediation system, the state special education process. And if you're interested in that continued information, we'll be glad to send it to you. Please feel free to email us or call us and request information on that. Again, reaching agreement can happen through consensus, can happen through what we call the facilitated IEP process, through mediation. There's also a complaint process that's available to parents. Taking it one step further, if in fact the complaint process through the Department of Public Instruction does not meet the needs of the parent, then you can go to a specific hearing, and then there's also what we call a resolution session. There are certain points that we would like to draw to your attention to have you remember. The IEP is to always be child-centered. We need to be sure everything that the IEP team does and discusses must be agreed upon and in writing into the IEP, and that it is very important for parents to communicate with their child's teacher as much as they possibly can. A good relationship with your child's teacher will help you and your child move toward your child's progress. Again, there are certain things that we must ask ourselves when we're discussing the IEP. We need to make sure that the IEP goals are measurable. And you need to ask yourself that question as you review your child's IEP. Is my child in the regular education environment all day or a part of the day? And why or why not? Does the IEP list modifications, accommodations, and support for my child in the state and district-wide assessments? Is the school expecting the kind of progress that I believe my child should make? Now, everybody who is a parent has some ideas about what their child can and cannot do. It is very important for you to provide that information to the IEP team so that they can make the decisions necessary for your child's progress. Also, is my child expected and able to meet specific graduation requirements? And also, don't be afraid to make sure that the IEP is reviewed in a timely fashion. That ends our slide presentation for today in our IEP. If you have any questions, please feel free to now jot them down in the question box. I don't see any at this time, but if you do, I'd be glad to answer them for you. Also, as a reminder, as I had mentioned before, we are in the process of reviewing and putting together a new webinar for college and career-ready IEPs that we're hoping will be done within the next couple of months, and we will provide that information to you. Also, a representative from the Department of Public Instruction will be doing their own webinar in college and career-ready IEPs later in this year. This now completes our webinar. We would like to thank everybody for participating today. Just as a